And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing this sea ice-free area up into the Chukchi Sea from the Bering Strait there, slowly closing off each day, and that trend will continue for the upcoming week here. And going on to tonight's weather again, still some areas of light snow here over the west, and dry with light winds over the central and eastern part of the state from Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, all the way up to the Arctic coast. Cold front drags across the western Aleutians with some light precipitation there. And wet conditions with gusty winds continue for the Panhandle. And that's starting to spread westward here along the eastern North Gulf Coast, approaching the Kenai Peninsula, but definitely sliding into Kodiak Island. Next front here, pushing northward tomorrow. And about midday tomorrow, winter storm warning goes into effect for the Klondike Highway, Haynesboro on up to Skagway, for 5 to 7 inches of snow to fall from noon Monday until noon Tuesday before it changes over to rain. Otherwise, wet and windy conditions, Panhandle, and spreading into the North Gulf Coast, a little farther north and west now into the Kenai Peninsula, at least the southern Kenai Peninsula, especially the east side there. Wet for Kodiak Island, and still lingering snow showers here in the west. And the outlook for Tuesday, that low pressure area pulls back into the Gulf of Alaska, definitely spreads clouds in over Cook Inlet, south central Alaska areas there, although could be some clearing there with that strong northwest downsloping flow off the Alaska Range, southern Cook Inlet, as well as Kodiak Island. Wet, windy conditions again, but winds a little lighter here for the coast, but it stays wet all the way up, rain or snow changing to rain over the northern Panhandle. Coastal water forecast down there for tomorrow. Good gales on the south coast out of the southeast, 40 to 45 knots. Clarence Strait, southeast winds 35 knots, with seas up to 16 feet. Gale warnings for Stevens Passage, east winds 40 knots. North winds 25 knots for Lynn Canal. And then east winds 35 to 50 knots for the central coast, and small craft advisories on the north coast for east winds 25 to 30 knots. And then for Tuesday, southeast winds a little gusty here for the central and northern inside waters. Clarence Strait, south winds 30 knots, seas 15 feet. South winds 30 to 35 knots on the south coast, and south-southeast 30 to 35 knots on the central coast. While the north coast will be looking at an east wind at 30 knots with 18 to 20 foot seas. And for Prince William Sound, Monday, northeast at 15 knots, seas 3 feet. North Gulf Coast, east-northeast winds, 30 knots. Northeast at 30 for the Barren Islands. Southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, north winds, 30 knots. Northern Cook Inlet, north at 20. And for Tuesday, Cook Inlet, lighter winds, north 10 to 15 knots, but northwest 45 knots, blasting out of Kamishak Bay here right across the Barren Islands. And north 20 to 25 knot winds for the North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, winds will be mostly north at about 20 knots with 3 foot seas. Kodiak Island, north winds 30 to 35 knots for the day Monday, with the Alaska Peninsula looking at gale force winds out of the northwest, 35 to 40 knots on the Pacific side, northwest 30 knots on the Bering Sea side. Bristol Bay, north winds 25 knots with 7 foot seas. For Tuesday, gale warnings, Kodiak Island, northwest winds 35 knots with higher gusts, and northwest 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay. For the western Aleutians tomorrow, west-northwest winds 35 knots, dropping off to about 30 knots here for Adak and Atka, still out of the west, seas 6 to 7 feet, and west-northwest 25 to 30 knot winds for the eastern Aleutians. And for Tuesday, not a lot of change here for the eastern Aleutians. West-northwesterlies 25 to 30 knots, west winds 30 knots for Adak and Atka. And then west to southwest winds 20 to 30 knots for the western Aleutians. For the southwest coast here, looking at northwest winds 20 to 30 knots, west at 30 for St. Matthew Island, the Pribilofs, northwest 20 knots. Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, northwest at 15. And there we go. For the southwest coast here on Tuesday, west 25 to 30 knots for the winds. Good gales for St. Matthew Island, southwest of 40 knots, seas 14 feet, southwest 30 knots for St. Paul and St. George with 13-foot seas, and west winds 25 knots for St. Lawrence Island. And for the Chukchi Sea tomorrow, kind of variable here, west to southeast of 15 knots, western Arctic coast east winds at 20 knots, light northeast breeze at 10 knots for the central Arctic coast, and east-northeast of 15 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline. And then for the central and eastern coast for Tuesday, light east winds at 10 knots, about 15 knots on the western Arctic coast, and for the Chukchi Sea, south to southwest wind at 15 knots.